everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar on securing the cloud for financial services with Jacob Serpa, a BitGlass product marketing manager. Before we begin, I want to mention that if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in and we'll get to as many as possible towards the end. And you'll also find some downloadable material in the attachments and links section, so make sure you check those out. And at the end of the webinar, please make sure to rate our webinar because feedback is really important to us so that we can make sure we're tailoring our content for future webinars to your needs and interests. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor over to Jacob. Jacob?
Hi everyone, thanks for being here today, and thanks Annie for the introduction. I'm excited to talk with everybody today about what you need for securing your financial services firms in the cloud. And we're going to start by briefly discussing the basics of the cloud and then go on to talk about specific security solutions and capabilities that you need as a financial, as well as why you actually need them. And if there's time in the end, we'll be sure to take some questions for a Q&A. So let's get started. Now, using cloud applications or cloud computing has pros and cons, and each can be more or less boiled down to two main points. For the benefits of using the cloud, the first is lower cost, and this is for a number of reasons. When you use cloud, you aren't shackled to traditional on-premises solutions and technologies. You don't have to invest in establishing your own infrastructure, and you don't have to maintain a large IT team. And obviously, those two things will both lead to lower costs. Now, at the same time, these benefits can also give firms more flexibility, and that's because with cloud solutions, it's easier to adapt to different levels of demand. For example, you wouldn't have to expand your IT team or your infrastructure quite as much. And the two main drawbacks of using the cloud are pretty tightly knit together. Now, without adequate security and procedures, it's very easy to lose sight of your data. Employees might use unsanctioned cloud applications or shadow IT without you knowing. It's a problem when you can't see what's being done with your data, because obviously you need to have visibility at all times over where your sensitive information is going. And if you don't know where your data is, then it's obviously challenging to control or manage that data. For regulated industries like finance, that's obviously a huge problem because you're held to a higher standard when it comes to what happens with your data. Now, the move to the cloud is becoming more and more of a necessity to compete today. So you have to find out how to gain the benefits of the cloud without accepting the costs along with them. And the problem is that traditional security solutions aren't adequate once you start using the cloud. They worked great in the past, but now they aren't quite as helpful as they used to be. So historically, organizations have focused on securing their infrastructure and putting agents on trusted devices. They focused on premises security because they didn't have to worry as much about data outside of their firewalls. But as data moves beyond that corporate firewall and employees start to access it from unmanaged devices, that strategy pretty much falls apart. And using agents on all devices accessing corporate data isn't super realistic. And that's partially because having a wide-scale agent deployment is pretty logistically difficult, especially with BYOD and all the different devices that your employees will use. And on top of that, agents will harm devices' functionality and the user's privacy. So people usually don't buy in as much as the organization might like. And that's understandable when, as an employee, your employer wants you to install something on your phone that can potentially harm battery life, make it slower, and give them access to your personal information that you want to stay personal. So that's just to say that the traditional set of solutions isn't as helpful as it used to be. Something with consideration for cloud is needed now because cloud is where data is going. So some organizations try to rely on API solutions on cloud applications, but even though those can protect data at rest and exercise some access control, they can't do things like secure data on endpoints or offer many real-time capabilities. So you're really only getting partial security when you go the API-only route. Now, at this point, we want to take a poll and hear from all of you. And the question we want to ask you is, what does your organization currently use for cloud security? So go ahead and pick the answer that best reflects your firm's current stance. We really just want to know where you are with your security. And the options are traditional on-premises solutions, applications API-only solutions, agents, or a CASB, or a cloud access security broker. So we'll give you a few moments to answer that. All right, so looks like we've got some answers that are starting to come in here. Now, what we're seeing today is a lot of people are still trying to cling on to traditional on-premises solutions, which is fairly consistent with what we have here. But at the same time, a lot of people are moving on to recognize, the importance of cloud security and moving into the future of data protection. And so those middle two solutions, API-only solutions and agents, are they're kind of like the new norm. But what we're seeing in general is a shift towards CASBs, towards cloud access security brokers, and that's consistent with what Gartner, the analyst firm, what they see happening in the industry is a shift from these older solutions to something that's more complete, more holistic, and can provide greater protection in general. And that segues us pretty decently into our next point, which is what financial services firms need is a complete security solution like a cloud access security broker, or again, CASB for short. Specifically a CASB that does not rely on agents. And that's because of these three requirements that you can see here. Financials need to ensure complete real-time security for data in the cloud, in transit, and on all endpoints, whether those endpoints are managed or unmanaged. The next one is regulatory compliance, and regulatory compliance is critical for financial institutions, and their security solutions must help them meet regulations like GLBA or Gramm-Leach-Bliley. And finally, deployment is important because security measures don't mean anything if they can't actually be fully deployed. All the technology in the world it doesn't mean anything if you can't use it, if you can't get people to buy into it and to actually deploy it. So this step of deployment doesn't always get a lot of attention, but it's very important. So to achieve these three things, a comprehensive CASB is the way to go, and making sure that that comprehensive CASB is also agentless is pretty critical. For the rest of our time, we're going to focus on these three requirements, and as we go, we'll be talking about the different capabilities that you need. So let's start with security. Discovery tools are usually the first security tools that are sought out by organizations as they enter the cloud, because they provide visibility into where data goes now that it's not just sitting, on-prem, it's not behind the firewall. And when you're just starting to use the cloud, it would make sense that your first desire would be to know where your data is going now that it's not on-prem. You want to see where it is, but it's harder to see once it's kind of out floating in the cloud. So discovery tools are very important, and obviously it's not just for those young firms that are going to the cloud, but for mature firms that are also looking for security and to control their sensitive information. So what you want is a discovery tool that sees everything, from unsanctioned apps to anonymizers and so on and so forth. There isn't much of a limit on where data can go, and you want to be able to see it at all times. So discovery solutions should also have some kind of capability whereby they can tell you the relative risk of different destinations or cloud apps, for example. And usually that's going to involve some kind of numeric or qualitative ranking system. And that's helpful because you don't just want to know, oh, my data is going to apps A, B, and C. You want to know if any of those apps are dangerous, which ones you should be worried about, and which ones aren't a cause for concern at all. So you want visibility, but you also want some insight. Lastly, some stealthier threats can take a longer amount of time to reveal themselves, and you want a solution that can detect them. You want a tool that can take a long-term approach as well as a short-term approach. Now, discovery is necessary. You want those discovery tools, but they aren't sufficient. Just seeing threats and where data goes isn't enough. You want to be able to respond. So don't stop at discovery. You need to make sure that you don't just see your data, but that you control it as well. And that's where other cloud security capabilities come in, a few of them here. CASBs that use a combination of API integration and proxies can simultaneously integrate with applications to protect data in the cloud, and proxy traffic to provide real-time protection capabilities. And CASBs that do this are called multi-mode or hybrid CASBs. Gartner typically refers to them as multi-mode CASBs. And so that's what you want to be looking for, is a multi-mode or hybrid CASB. But a lot of CASBs say they're multi-mode, or they'll say complete, but they're often API only. In particular, what they usually lack is a robust reverse proxy that can address incoming requests and activities from unmanaged devices. And that's important because a lot of damage can be done from unmanaged devices. But like we said earlier, those API-only solutions, they don't protect much outside of cloud apps themselves, not to mention that some apps don't even allow for API integration. So you want to be careful when you're checking out your options, because the claims you hear don't always match reality. Now moving on to access controls, you don't want them to just be limited to static block and do not block options. You want them to be able to consider a lot of factors like geographic location and job function and past user behavior in real time. And more advanced access controls can recognize the issue when your Office 365 account logs in from California and then your Salesforce account logs in from Russia within a 5-minute span, for example. We'll mention how that works a little bit more later, but obviously having that intelligent access control capability is very helpful. Likewise, DLP policies, data leakage prevention, should have a host of tools like redaction, quarantining, etc., that take a real-time approach. As an example, you might want digital rights management or DRM, where step-up authentication can be enforced mid-session to ensure that users are who they say they are in case they start to exhibit anomalous behavior or do things that they don't normally do. Finally, for malware, don't just use signature-based protections. Those only work against known malware. Now, it's important to protect from known threats, but in addition to protecting from known threats, you want to make sure you have anti-malware that's able to protect from zero-day malware too. And zero-day malware is new and unknown. It's the more dangerous type that you need to watch out for. And they're more dangerous basically because what they do, how they work, and how to address them, how to get rid of them, isn't readily available. They're new, so there isn't as much knowledge about how to handle those things. And so usually the solutions that can protect against zero-day malware incorporate artificial intelligence or machine learning in some capacity so that they can identify threats and their potential for malicious behavior. That way you don't have to know what exactly the piece of malware is. You just have to be able to identify that it's a potential threat. And so you want protection for both of those things, known malware and unknown malware, but keep in mind that unknown malware is a little bit more of a priority and it's a little bit harder to address. Next, we move on to talk about mobile device security, and it deserves special consideration because of how much mobile devices allow for rapid remote access to corporate data. You might even say they have secretive access to corporate data sometimes. And the first thing you want to ensure when you're looking for a mobile solution is that you get a data-centric solution instead of a device-centric solution. What I mean by that is focus on protecting data rather than on controlling devices. The number of devices employees can access data from is effectively endless. So it's really better to focus on protecting data rather than on controlling that endless number of devices through agents that need to be installed on every single one of them. It would obviously be very time-consuming to go that route and then to have to maintain them and to do regular maintenance on all those devices. So what an agentless solution can do is it can let you use tools like selective wipe, where you're solely focused on controlling and deleting corporate data from personal mobile devices, instead of tools like full wipe, where you effectively control and wipe the entire phone and make no distinction between personal and corporate data. Obviously, users wouldn't be very happy about that, and so it's important to make that distinction between personal data and corporate data on personal mobile devices. UEBA, User and Entity Behavior Analytics, those consider the behaviors of users and detect anomalous activities or strange behaviors that pose risks. And ideally, you're going to have UEBA that will be tied into contextual access controls and DLP that work with mobile devices for real-time mobile security. And UEBA isn't just for mobile, but it's very useful when we're talking about mobile security because, again, mobile access to data is it's rapid, it's remote, and it can be done in a secretive way if you're not paying attention. And finally, even while taking a data-centric approach and not using agents, enforcing some non-invasive security settings on mobile devices is still a pretty good idea, provided, again, that you aren't using agents and you aren't being a bother to the owners of those devices. For example, you may want to enforce shorter time limits before phones lock, or you could require PIN codes instead of swipe patterns to unlock them if you feel those are more secure. Basically, you can do things that don't have much of an impact on the user, but that can help ensure additional layers of security. Again, as long as you're not having too much of an adverse impact on their experience and on their use of their device. So with all these security features in mind, we've talked about discovery, cloud, and mobile. Let's move on to talk about compliance. Financials are pretty heavily regulated, probably more than almost any other industry, and there's lots to keep track of to ensure compliance, as you all know very well. They handle a lot of sensitive data like PII and PCI, and they have to protect it. PII being personally identifiable information and PCI being payment card industry data. Now, encryption is a very good way to protect this data from the prying eyes of unauthorized and even malicious insiders and outsiders. Your threats can come from both directions, but you want to make sure you only encrypt what's necessary. Encrypting everything is not necessary or even wise most of the time, so make sure you encrypt what's necessary. And for structured data, which is organized into rows and columns, you think of an Excel spreadsheet, for example, you would want to encrypt sensitive fields or columns that contain things like social security numbers, for example. For unstructured data, which doesn't really have a set format and is just kind of lumped together and exists in a number of different file formats, you still want to be able to identify and encrypt sensitive information regardless of how it looks or how it appears. It's important to note that however and whatever you encrypt, the best option is to hold your own encryption keys locally so that no third parties can access your sensitive data. If a cloud vendor holds both your encrypted data as well as your encryption keys, you can lose everything if they get hacked. I would compare it to storing a key with its lock. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But at the same time, as a financial, you probably don't want your cloud vendors looking at your data either. So there's kind of a twofold benefit here in that if your data is compromised by your cloud vendor, you hold the key, so you're safe. But also, because you hold the key, those vendors won't see your data either. But just encrypting your data, that's not enough, because there are two things you need to consider when you're selecting what type of encryption you want, and those two things are strength and usability. Encryption should be full strength. You'll want to look out for the number 256. You'll hear things like AES 256 with 256-bit IV or initialization vectors. So basically, just look out for that number 256. But you don't want to have your data masked to the extent that you can't do anything with it. Like, you want that full strength encryption, but you also want to maintain functionality, so you can do things like sort and search through that encrypted data. And that's a technologically challenging feat, because encryption basically turns your data into gibberish. And it's hard to encrypt data so that it's disguised and safe, but then use it as if it weren't. So to address that, what some companies do is reduce their IVs. They reduce the randomness of their encryption. They basically weaken their encryption so that it can still support functions like search. But that kind of defeats the purpose of encryption. If you're going to protect your data, you should actually protect your data. It doesn't make sense to have a security measure that only half works, because you have to trade off between protection and function. Obviously, you don't want that. So make sure that your encryption is full strength and provides full functionality, and just pay attention when you're looking at encryption. You want to look for that number 256 to describe both the encryption and the IVs, or the initialization vectors. For everything we've discussed so far, deployability, as I kind of alluded to earlier, may be the most important, because solutions are useless if they can't actually be deployed. One insecure device could be all that it takes to enable just a massive breach. So you want to be sure your solutions are fully deployed. And that's why agentless CASBs are definitely the way to go. Agentless solutions don't require any installations or maintenance. Employees essentially just use their native apps normally, and that's all there is to it for them. From the user's perspective, nothing really changes, so they don't have much of a reason to refuse it. And because no installations are required, and you know, there's no maintenance required, and you're not going to be messing with devices, there's nothing to harm those devices or to violate employee privacy. With agents, as I mentioned earlier, employees' personal traffic and activity can be monitored, and their devices often run less quickly and efficiently than they do without agents. Basically, install something on your device that can let your employer invade your privacy and forces your battery to die more quickly, among other things. But that isn't an issue when you go agentless. So that's obviously the route you want to take if you want employees to actually adopt your solution. I know I've hit this point quite a bit, but it's definitely important, the difference between agents and agentless. So together, these factors allow for rapid, complete deployment and employee buy-in, meaning that you can start securing your data much more quickly than you could with other solutions. Now, here on this slide again, we've talked about each of our three requirements from earlier: the comprehensive security, the regulatory compliance, and the full deployment. And only a complete agentless CASB can offer these three things to the extent needed by financial services firms. And so to transition just a bit, BitGlass is an agentless CASB that offers total data protection wherever data goes. We can help meet those three requirements that we just mentioned. BitGlass is backed by a number of global tier 1 investors, some of which you can see here, and is considered the #1 real-time CASB because we can protect data, whether it's in the cloud, on endpoints, or in transit between the two in real time. And that's a departure from a lot of competitors who only provide after-the-fact capabilities when it's already too late and your data has been compromised. And so that's why some analysts will call us the Cadillac of CASB, because we have high quality and complete protection all in one readily available solution. So to conclude this portion of the webinar, I wanted to present a use case that sums up our ability to provide the tools we've been discussing today. So BitGlass was previously approached by a financial services giant that wanted to migrate to the cloud and simultaneously secure Salesforce and Office 365. So the solution we provided them offered full-strength encryption with full functionality in terms of search and sort, like we talked about. And we also gave them full control of their encryption keys, since, again, that can allow you more control over who sees your data. We also gave them real-time DLP and access controls that worked across all devices, as well as our discovery tool for breaches and shadow IT. Basically everything we've talked about today. So this example does a pretty good job of summing up the kinds of issues financials face, kinds of tools that they need, and how an agentless CASB like BitGlass can provide what they're looking for. And again, that's security, compliance, and deployment. So that about wraps us up. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for joining the webinar today, and hopefully this has been helpful for you. And we do have just a couple minutes left, so let's go ahead and transition to a quick Q&A and just see what kind of questions we have. Okay, so first question, if we've already deployed an agent, why would we want to switch to a CASB? That's a really good question. I was trying to allude to it a little bit as we went here. A few reasons. The first is maintenance. Even if you have the agent deployed, it's on those devices already. If you need to do maintenance or update those or whatever the case may be, you basically have to go back through all of those devices. So it's not necessarily a one and done thing once you deploy your agents. Second, there's no way to be fully sure of where data is and where your employees are accessing that data from. You can have agents on devices, but what's stopping that employee from accessing data from a device that does not have an agent? There's not necessarily a way to see that if you're just relying on agents. But in my mind, one of the most important reasons to make this switch is agents, they violate employee privacy quite a bit. They tend to gather much more data than we're aware of. They see their personal traffic. They can even do something like hook into their GPS at times, and so that's obviously can be a big concern. So those are three reasons why it's good to switch from agents to CASB.
Good. Okay, so we're hitting the half-hour mark, so we're going to wrap it up here. And hopefully you guys found this really useful, and we appreciate your attendance. And don't forget to rate our webinar and provide feedback, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.